And welcome back to you all. Thank you so much for staying with Newsworld right here on Channel 405. Let's continue with our bulletin this evening. Southern Africa is experiencing one of the worst droughts in years, with more than 40 million people expected to face food insecurity because of livestock and crop losses. Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia and Zimbabwe have declared this year's drought an emergency. Droughts are so frequent that the government plans to stop calling it an emergency and instead make drought alleviation part of the national budget.
Farmers in semi-arid Botswana are reeling after the worst drought in a decade wiped out entire harvests and left the land littered with dead livestock. Two-thirds of the crops planted last season failed, while Ngamiland, a rich beef-producing region, has recorded nearly 40,000 cattle deaths. Ranger Caspar Matseka says there was no food or water, so his animals starved to death.
The goats die, as well as the cattle. As you can see, the carcasses all over. We were really affected. If only the government could subsidize the prices of feed and vaccines for the livestock during such time.
The drought has not spared wildlife. National Parks authorities have resorted to feeding starving hippos, while hundreds of elephants have died. The competition for food and water has increased the risk of human-wildlife conflict.
Because the livestock are now putting pressure onto the wildlife areas. So the wildlife are also getting pressure on the areas that's moving. So that is where the conflict zone is. And I'm bringing that up because it's all interconnected with the drought. Is this human-wildlife conflict?
Botswana's President Mokgweetsi Masisi says the government plans to make drought relief funds a part of every national budget.
Government has taken a decision to develop a drought management strategy which would classify drought as a permanent feature in our budget plans rather than an emergency. The strategy will be completed before the end of this financial year.
Acting Director of Meteorological Services, Raditupa says a robust strategy is needed to deal with.
Now, we are seeing the impacts now in terms of the heating, in terms of the heat waves, in terms of the dry spells, in terms of excessive rain. Therefore, we need to really adapt as a nation.
Meanwhile, a forecast for rain has raised hopes among farmers and rangers for recovery, and that the season of severe drought won't be a total loss.
And our surging violence by criminal gangs in Central America has led to an increase in asylum seekers at the southern U.S. border, as local authorities in Honduras and El Salvador struggle to counter the gangs and drug smugglers. U.S. military forces are trying to help. These are just some of the troops working to improve security in those countries.
These drugs won't make it to the United States, thanks to men and women at this cooperative security location in El Salvador.
We had to launch that today on a mission.
Here, U.S. Navy crews gather intelligence and patrol the skies.
They will locate and attempt to isolate that target, and then they will try to call in a interdiction asset, whether it's the U.S. Coast Guard or one of our host nation partners. And there isn't a day that goes by that they don't see a contact out there that they suspect is smuggling drugs.
Last year, U.S. Southern Command helped interdict 280 metric tons of drugs. About one-third of the command's missions launched from here, disrupting tens of thousands of kilos of cocaine. This victory board helps visualize their success.
Here's this one, 1.1 billion.
Pretty valuable board, huh?
Monetarily wise, billions is what we talk about, but the lives that we impact, it's tremendous, it's invaluable.
It's more efficient to transit at sea, with the bigger packets.
Admiral Craig Fowler oversees all the missions across U.S. Southern Command.
Is 2019 shaping up to be a record year?
We had an excellent year in fiscal year 19, but it's never enough.
U.S. security assistance to Latin America has a checkered past. In the 1980s, Washington's war on drugs and determination to keep communism out of the Western Hemisphere led to policies backing militaries that terrorized local populations.
The unfortunate part was that they committed a lot of human rights violations and killed a lot of innocent people. And so I think that left a real scar.
Today, U.S. troops in neighboring Honduras say they want to make local populations a priority. The team's work in areas like San Pedro Sula, once called the murder capital of the world, allows medical teams to practice for war.
Things that you would see in combat zone, like we talked about San Pedro Sula with the machete injuries and with gunshot wounds.
They also provide basic care, including dentistry.
They pull 3 teeth out of a woman who has had no dental care in 10 years. I like to think that they're making a difference in her life and that she's going to decide to stay here.
The UN estimates that Central America will have more than 500,000 people displaced by the end of this year, a sign of the desperate circumstances these U.S. troops are hoping to improve.
Thanks for what you do here.
And now UNICEF has appealed for $4.2 billion in emergency funding for 2020, which is the biggest ever ask for donors. Well, it hopes to give life-saving support to 59 million children in 64 countries around the world. Well, it's 3.5 times bigger than the funds requested in 2010. Let's discuss this further now. I'm joined via Skype by James Alder, who is the Regional Chief of Communications for Eastern and Southern Africa. James, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on the program this evening. Perhaps let's start this conversation over here. This is the largest emergency funding requested by UNICEF to assist starving children across the country. What has actually prompted the steep increase?
Well, unfortunately, what's prompted it is that we have an unprecedented number of children in conflicts and in climate crises, basically since we've been keeping records. So over decades and decades and decades, right now, as you can see there, we're talking about 59 million children in need in 2020. That's an extraordinary number that UNICEF's seeking to reach. If you break 59 million down, it's basically UNICEF and partners seeking to reach 100 children every single hour. So the enormity of what we're facing is unprecedented. It's important that this is very serious. It shouldn't be somber, though. There are ways to raise these funds. You've got to remember that whether we're talking Syria or South Sudan or Zimbabwe, as we just were, or DRC, the people who are in those countries who are facing the challenge, they're doing it with bravery and resourcefulness and resolve. So it's up to the rest of the world, those donors and philanthropic groups and governments in rich countries, to now come forward. $4 billion is a lot of money. Again, you break it down, it's about $45, probably 600 Rand per person UNICEF's trying to reach next year. It's not a lot of money in the situation these people are in.
And now, James, perhaps how would you then describe the difference between this emergency fund, which is always, sometimes termed as the flexible fund, towards the normal fixed fund that the organization has already?
Yeah, the difference is that when donors, when governments, I was at an event in Geneva in Europe yesterday with a lot of very wealthy people who are looking to support and various organizations and philanthropic groups, and the big ones, of course, the European Union and British DFID and so on and so on. And the big difference is when they do give what's called flexible funding to UNICEF, it allows UNICEF to use it very quickly in the ways that it sees best fit in those emergencies. A lot of funding comes with this needs to be used around A, B, and C, which is great, but quite frequently, given the way an emergency is on the ground and the way things change so quickly, we need to change our response. So it's about getting that money, but it's about also having those flexible funds. I mean, at the end of the day, such as the enormity of conflicts around the world, of children on the move, and as you were looking at earlier in your show, the climate crisis, that we've got to be flexible with the funding that comes in.
And now, James, the appeal actually states that over 64 countries, consisting of thousands and thousands of children, are in need of life-saving support. What are some of the major drivers for such matters?
Yeah, you are talking crazy numbers. As I say, it risks being overwhelming, but I'm committed every time I see families, whether it be recently in Zim or recently in South Sudan. You just see how they are the front line. They're the ones doing the most. Every now and then they just need a leg up. But in terms of what's happening, as your viewers would know, we've got a crisis in Syria, a conflict in Syria that's gone on for 9 years. Devastating conflict in Yemen, so there's a lot of need. South Sudan, here, that's great hard. People there, democratic forces.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave that conversation over there due to some technical problems. But that was UNICEF's Chief of Communications in the Eastern and Southern Africa region, Mr. James Alder, speaking to us more about this appeal that the organization has made. On that note, it's time now to take a short break. Do stay tuned for more news and updates.